Little homeless girls walked into the hospital, pouring Fanta into the mouth of a billionaire that has been in coma for over 2 years, saving his life. The sprawling Ikoyi mansion, named Udo Peace by its owners, was bathed in the molten gold of a slowly setting Sunday sun. The air, thick with the scent of jasmine from the manicured gardens, hummed with a rare and perfect contentment. Within the grand living room, where tasteful African art mingled with floor-to-ceiling windows, a symphony of laughter rose and fell, the sweetest music billionaire Alastair Adebayo had ever known. At 58, Alastair possessed a fortune that spanned continents, but in this moment, his wealth was counted not in billions of naira, but in the faces around him. He leaned back into the plush embrace of his favorite armchair, a simple, well-worn piece that defied the room's elegance, and watched his universe in motion. His wife, Neoma, was the steady, radiant sun at the center. She moved with a graceful efficiency, refilling glasses of Zobo, her laughter, a rich, melodic sound, sparking more laughter in return. She caught his gaze in her eyes, still holding the mischievous sparkle of the university girl he'd fallen for 35 years ago, softened. A silent conversation passed between them, a language of shared memory and profound gratitude. Her galley was slightly askew from the day's activities, and it made his heart swell with a love so fierce it was almost painful. Their eldest, Chaik, a mirror of Alastair in ambition and build, was holding court. He was passionately, and with grand gestures, explaining a new venture capital idea to his younger sister, Amara. "You see, it's about disruptive sustainability," Chaik said, slicing the air with his hand. Amara, the pragmatic doctor who had flown in from London just the day before, listened with an arched eyebrow and a smile playing on her lips. "Disruptive, or just destructive to your investors' peace of mind, brother?" she teased, adjusting the tiny, sleeping form of her 2-month-old son, Chitty, nestled against her chest. The sight of his first grandchild sent a fresh wave of warmth through Alastair. The baby was a promise, a continuation. Tochi, their baby at 22, was sprawled on the Persian rug, his long limbs everywhere, engrossed in a video game on the giant screen, but still interjecting into the adult conversation with surprising wit. His University of Lagos hoodie was a splash of casual youth amidst the finery. This was the ritual Alastair cherished above all board meetings and deal closings, the Sunday family dinner. The staff had been given the evening off. Neoma had, with the children's chaotic help, prepared a feast: ofada rice with a fiery ayame stew, pounded yam, and a whole grilled tilapia. The empty plates now bore testament to the meal's success. "You know," Alastair began, his voice a calm, deep baritone that naturally drew the room's attention. "When I was a boy in that 2-room apartment in Suralere, sharing a mattress with my brothers, if someone had told me my greatest treasure would be the noise in this room, I would have called them mad. I thought it was about the silence at the top, the big house, the quiet car." He paused, letting his eyes travel over each beloved face. "I was a fool. This din, your arguing, your laughter, Tochi's terrible game sounds. This is the symphony. This is the wealth no bank can hold." A comfortable quiet fell, filled with unspoken emotion. Neoma came over, placing a hand on his shoulder. He covered it with his own. "Stop being so wise, Dad," Tochi said from the floor, not looking up from his game. "You'll make Amara cry, and then the baby will wake up and cry, and it'll be a whole thing." They all laughed, the tension of sentiment beautifully broken. Later, as dusk deepened into velvet night, Alastair and Neoma stood on the wide balcony overlooking the city's glittering lights. The sounds of Lagos, a distant, rhythmic hum, floated up to them. "They're wonderful, aren't they?" Neoma sighed, leaning into him. "They are because of you," he said, kissing her temple. "You built this, and any. The empire, it's just concrete and numbers. You built the living, breathing heart of it." She looked up at him. "We built it, Ollie. Together. From that leaky flat in Yaba." She grew thoughtful. "You leave for Kenya tomorrow. 2 weeks is too long. It's for a good cause. These tech hubs, they could create 100 young Alastairs. 1,000. His eyes shone with the vision. "But I'll carry you all with me. I always do." Inside, Chaik was helping clear the table. Amara was gently rocking Chitty, singing a soft lullaby. Tochi had finally abandoned his game, and was stealing the last plantain from the serving dish. Alistair breathed it all in, this perfect, fragile ecosystem of love he had nurtured. He felt a profound sense of completion, a chapter so rich and full it felt like an entire, well-lived life. There was not a shadow of premonition, not a flicker of doubt. In this golden hour, enveloped by the tangible proof of his life's work and love, Alistair Adebayo was, without question, the happiest man alive. He did not know that this was not just another Sunday, but the last page of an era, that the next chapter would be written not in the ink of laughter and shared stew, but in the stark, sterile language of beeping machines and suspended hope. For now, there was only peace, only Udo, and the deep, abiding certainty that this was what it all had been for. The parting kiss. The Tuesday morning dawned crisp and clear over Lagos, the sky a hopeful canvas of pale blue and wisps of white. In the master suite of the Ikoyi mansion, the mood was a bittersweet blend of excitement and the gentle ache of imminent separation. Sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating Neoma as she moved with a quiet, purposeful efficiency around the open suitcase laid on their large bed. Alistair's suitcase. It was a sleek, titanium thing, a gift from Chike for his last birthday, but Neoma treated it with a ritualistic care that transformed it from a corporate accessory into a vessel of her love. "Your blue agbada is in the garment bag," she said, her voice soft but clear in the morning quiet. "The one with the gold thread. You must look the part for the opening ceremony in Nairobi." She smoothed the rich fabric with her palms, a small, wistful smile on her face. The Kenyans have their own style, but they respect a man who knows his own cloth. Alistair, already dressed in the comfortable travel clothes he favored, dark slacks and a simple, impeccably tailored linen shirt, watched her from the doorway of his walk-in closet. He was checking his briefcase for the third time, a nervous habit he'd never shaken before a major trip, but his attention was entirely on his wife. He saw the careful way she arranged his socks, rolled and tucked into shoes. The discreet compartment where she'd placed his preferred brand of antacid tablets, knowing the rich official dinners would disagree with him. The novel he'd been meaning to read, now nestled beside his tablet. She was packing not just items, but a layer of home, of her presence. "Inini, you know the hotel will have everything," he said gently, coming to stand behind her. He wrapped his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. He breathed in her scent, sandalwood and shea butter, the most familiar and comforting aroma in his world. "Hotel soap is harsh on your skin," she replied matter-of-factly, continuing her work. "And their pillows are never right. I packed your neck pillow, the memory foam one." She then turned in his arms, her expression shifting to one of playful sternness. "And you will use it? No trying to work the entire flight. Promise me." "I promise," he said, his eyes sincere. He kissed her forehead. 2 weeks. For cities. Meetings, handshakes, speeches about empowering the next generation. And then I am on the first flight back to this. He gestured around their room, but they both knew he meant to her, to the life they'd built within these walls and beyond. Neoma pulled away slightly, her eyes growing misty. She walked to her dressing table and picked up a small, silver-framed photograph. It was a picture she had taken just a week ago. Alistair, looking utterly disarmed and enchanted, holding a sleeping baby chitty in his massive hands. The contrast between the powerful billionaire and the tiny, trusting infant was profoundly moving. "So you don't forget what you're coming back to," she said, her voice thick with emotion as she slipped the framed photo between 2 soft sweaters in the suitcase. It wasn't just a picture of his grandson. It was a symbol of his legacy, of the future he was working to build, of the softness that balanced his steely public persona. Alistair's throat tightened. He took her hands in his. "As if I could. You and the children, and now this little one. You are my compass, Neoma. Every deal I make, every hub I build, it's so that the world might be a little better for them. For Chitty and all the children like him." Downstairs, the house began to stir. They could hear Tochi's loud, cheerful voice arguing with the cook about taking pancakes for the road. The sound made them both smile. One by one, their children came to say goodbye. Chike, already in a sharp suit, gave his father a firm handshake that turned into a brief, back-slapping hug. "Safe travels, Dad. The board is ready for the update when you return. Make us proud. I'll try not to embarrass you." Alistair chuckled, clapping his son on the back. Amara, with Chitty now awake and alert in her arms, approached. "Look at Granddad, my love." She cooed to the baby, then looked at her father. "Don't overdo it, Daddy. Your blood pressure, remember? Actually, don't answer that. Just be safe." She leaned in, and he kissed her cheek, then the soft, downy head of his grandson, his heart squeezing with a fierce, protective love. Tochi bounded in, smelling of syrup and teenage spirit. "Bring me back something cool, Dad. A Maasai spear or something. I'll see what I can do that won't get me arrested at customs." Alistair laughed, pulling his youngest into a rough, affectionate hug. "Look after your mother, and try to attend at least one lecture this week." Finally, it was time. Emmanuel, his driver of 20 years, a man who had become more a friend and confidant than an employee, stood patiently by the sleek black car, its engine purring softly. The luggage was loaded. On the front steps, under the portico, Alistair turned to Neoma. The morning sun caught the silver strands in her hair, making her look like a queen touched by starlight. All the words, the promises, the love, the plans for his return, were already spoken. They lived in the space between their linked gazes. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs stroking her cheeks. 2 weeks, he whispered again a vow. 2 weeks, she echoed, her hands coming up to cover his. "Go with God, Ollie. Build your hubs. Change your world. Then come home." Their kiss was not one of desperate passion, but of deep, abiding connection. It was a seal, a promise of continuity. It tasted of love, of hope, of a tomorrow that was assured. He got into the car. Emmanuel gave Neoma a respectful nod and a warm smile before closing the door. As the car glided down the long, tree-lined driveway, Alistair turned to look out the rear window. Neoma stood on the steps, one hand raised in a final wave, the other pressed to her lips, a solitary, beautiful figure silhouetted against the grand facade of their home. He turned back around, settling into the leather seat, a smile still on his face. He glanced at his briefcase, already thinking of the first presentation. He did not look back again. He had no reason to. He was Alistair Adebayo, embarking on a mission of goodwill, with the love of his family solid as a rock behind him and the open road ahead. The last image he carried from home was not one of foreboding, but of perfect love, waving him on. He was going out into the world, fully expecting to return and fold himself back into that same embrace. The thought filled him with a serene, unshakable confidence as the car merged into the streaming, chaotic, vibrant life of a Lagos morning. The screech of metal. The journey from the cloistered serenity of Ikoyi to the controlled chaos of Murtala Mohammed International Airport was a familiar narrative, a sequence of scenes Alistair had played out countless times. Yet today, every detail seemed etched in a sharper, more significant light. Inside the cool, quiet cabin of the car, the world was muted. The aggressive horns, the cacophonous calls of street hawkers, the thumping bass from Danfo buses, all were reduced to a distant symphony behind the soundproofed glass. Alistair felt a profound sense of peace, a bubble of contentment that had traveled with him from his doorstep. Emmanuel, a sturdy, reliable presence behind the wheel, caught his eye in the rearview mirror. "The traffic is not too bad today, Olga. We will be at the airport with time to spare." "Good, good, Emmanuel," Alistair replied, his gaze drifting to the city flowing past his window. He saw the familiar tapestry of Lagos life, the impeccably dressed bankers waiting for buses, the market women with impossible loads balanced on their heads, the laughing children in crisp school uniforms. It was a city of relentless struggle and even more relentless hope. His city, the thought of the tech hubs he would help establish filled him with a fresh surge of purpose. He imagined a young version of himself, in Kibera or Mathar, being given a key to a future he couldn't yet envision. He opened his briefcase, not to work, but to take out the small, silver-framed photo Neoma had packed. Baby Chitty's peaceful, sleeping face looked back at him. Alistair traced the frame with his finger. This is why, he thought. For the next generation. For their peace. "Chitty is growing fast, Olga," Emmanuel remarked, his voice warm. He had driven Neoma to the hospital for Amara's delivery. He had been part of the family's joy. "He is," Alistair said, a smile breaking across his face. "A new human being, Emmanuel. A whole new life, with all its potential. It's miraculous." They were on the expressway now, picking up speed. The airport was a concrete horizon in the distance. The morning sun glinted off the bonnet of the car. Alistair put the photo away, feeling a pleasant anticipation for the flight, for the work ahead. He settled back, closing his eyes for a moment, replaying the morning's goodbyes. He did not see the tanker. It was a massive, articulated vehicle, lumbering in the lane beside them, loaded with something unseen. What happened next was a chain of events so swift, so catastrophic, that time itself seemed to fracture. Later, witnesses would say the tanker's rear axle snapped, or its driver, fatigued from an endless shift, simply lost control. The cause didn't matter in the end. The effect was absolute. There was a deafening bang, the sound of a giant's spine snapping. The tanker's trailer, suddenly a rogue, multi-ton pendulum, jackknifed violently across the highway. Emmanuel's reaction was instantaneous, a driver's primal instinct. He wrenched the wheel, his mouth open in a silent shout. The car's tires screeched a protest that tore through the morning air. For Alistair, the world became a violent, disorienting carousel. The safe, muted cabin exploded into a nightmare of shattering glass. A kaleidoscope of sky, asphalt, and twisted metal whirled outside the windows. The force of the impact was not a punch, but an all-consuming compression, as if the universe had decided to collapse in on this single point on the expressway. He heard a sickening, wet crunch, the sound of his own world breaking, mingled with the scream of tearing steel. The airbags deployed with a gunshot-like pop, a white cloud that did nothing to stop the intrusion of the collapsing roof. Then, silence. A thick, dusty, terrifying silence, broken only by the sporadic hiss of escaping fluids and the faint, persistent tinkle of falling glass shards. Alistair Adebayo was pinned, his body angled at an unnatural, cruel pose. A shard of his own window was embedded in his shoulder, but he felt no pain. He felt nothing. His brilliant mind, which had built empires and navigated millions of deals, was a dark, quiet room. The last conscious signal it had registered was the sight of the silver photo frame, now cracked, flying past his vision, baby Chitty's face spinning away into the chaos. Outside, people were screaming, running. Someone was shouting for help on a phone. The smell of petrol and hot metal began to seep into the wreckage. Emmanuel, in the driver's seat, was already gone. His head rested against the steering wheel, as if in prayer, a final, tragic stillness. For Alistair, there was no prayer, no final thought of Neoma or the children, no memory of the parting kiss. There was only the retreat into a deep, silent well, a coma that descended not like sleep, but like a blanket of infinite nothingness, smothering the golden light of that Ikoyi morning, the sound of laughter, the taste of promise. The sirens, when they came, were a distant echo in a world that was already receding. The billionaire, the husband, the father, the philanthropist, was pulled from the wreckage of metal and memory, a broken vessel. The man who had everything was now reduced to the most fragile of things, a flicker on a monitor, a breath sustained by a machine, a story suspended mid-sentence, waiting for an ending that seemed, in that moment of twisted steel and spreading silence, impossible to write. The vigil begins. The private suite on the top floor of St. Augustine's Hospital was a world away from the expressway's violence. It was a room of hushed tones, muted beiges, and filtered light, smelling of antiseptic and a desperate, bottled-up hope. It was here they brought what remained of Alistair Adebayo. In the first hours, the room was a storm of controlled panic. Specialists from Lagos, London, and Zurich moved in a grim ballet around the bed, their faces lit by the glow of scanning machines, their voices low and urgent. Words like diffuse axonal injury, medically induced coma, and cerebral edema sliced through the air, clinical and cold. Neoma stood in a corner, still in the clothes she'd worn to see him off, now stained with expressway dust and a dark, terrifying smudge that might have been oil or blood. She clutched the shattered silver photo frame in one hand, its glass cracked across baby Chitty's face. The children arrived in staggered, shell-shocked waves. Chike, his corporate armor shattered, paced the hallway like a caged animal, barking orders into his phone not because they were needed, but because action was the only thing holding his terror at bay. Amara, the doctor, stood paralyzed by a duality no medical training could prepare her for. The professional who understood the bleak statistics scrolling across the monitors, and the daughter whose world was collapsing. Tochi simply crumpled into a chair in the waiting area, his face buried in his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent, disbelieving sobs. When the lead neurosurgeon, a weary-eyed man with a gentle South African accent, finally approached Neoma, the storm in the room settled into a chilling calm. "We've stabilized him, Mrs. Adebayo," he said, his hand resting lightly on her arm. "The surgery relieved the pressure. But the trauma to the brain, it is profound. He is in a deep coma. The journey ahead will be one of patience." "Will he wake up?" Neoma asked, her voice a stranger's, thin and scraped raw. The doctor's hesitation was the loudest sound in the room. "The brain is a mystery. We will watch. We will wait. And you," he said, his gaze encompassing her shattered family. "You must talk to him. He may hear you. It can be a lifeline." And so, the vigil began. Neoma never left. A cot was brought in, then ignored. She sat in the high-backed chair she had pulled flush to his bedside. Her world shrunk to the radius of his still hand. She began to talk, her voice a fragile thread cast into the deep, silent well where he had fallen. "Alistair," she whispered that first night, her lips close to his ear, the beep of the ventilator a metronome to her grief. "It's Neoma. You are in the hospital. You had an accident. But you are safe now. The children are here. He's managing things. Don't worry about a thing." She recounted their life, stitching their history back together as if to remind him who he was. "Do you remember our first date? At that awful cafe near campus with the bitter coffee? You spilled yours all over your only good shirt. You were so embarrassed, but I just laughed. I knew then, Ollie. I knew I would love you." She played music. "Fellas, water no get enemy," filled the sterile space, its defiant, joyful horns a stark contrast to the stillness in the bed. She brought in photographs, their wedding day, the children's graduations, last year's Christmas, and propped them around the room, creating a gallery of the life that waited for him. She massaged his hands, those strong, capable hands that had built so much. She worked each finger, remembering how they felt intertwined with hers, remembering the weight of them on her shoulder as they watched the sunset from their balcony. She lathered them with the same sandalwood-scented lotion he used at home, fighting the clinical smell of the hospital, trying to anchor him to the familiar. Tochi got a B on his economics paper. She would report, her tone shifting to the mundane, as if this were a normal conversation over dinner. "He tried to hide it, but I found out. Amara is fighting with the hospital admin about her leave. She wants to stay longer. And Chitty," he smiled today, Ollie. A real, proper smile. "It was for you. He's waiting to meet his granddad properly." Days bled into weeks. The initial flood of visitors, business associates, government ministers, well-meaning friends, trickled to a stop. The crisis became a condition. The shocking became the routine. The family adjusted to a new, horrifying normalcy, orbiting the silent sun at the center of the suite. But Neoma's vigil never wavered. Her prayers, whispered into the quiet hum of the machines, were simple and relentless. "Come back to me, Ollie. The children need their father. I need my husband. Just come back." In the silent moments, when exhaustion nearly overcame her, she would simply hold his hand and look at his face. The handsome, strong face now slack, the intelligent eyes hidden behind closed lids, the mouth that had spoken words of love and vision now held shut by a breathing tube. The contrast between the vibrant man who had kissed her goodbye and this silent, dependent form was a physical pain in her chest, a wound that reopened every morning. Yet, in the act of her vigil, in the talking, the touching, the relentless assertion of their shared life, she found a purpose. She was the keeper of his memory, the guardian of his identity, the bridge between the man he had been and the hope that he might be again. As long as she sat there, telling their story, Alistair Adebayo was not just a body in a bed. He was a husband, a father, a man who was loved. And in that love, Neoma, amidst the overwhelming despair, clung to the faintest, most stubborn ember of hope. The vigil was her act of defiance against the silence, a daily declaration that the story was not over. The slow erosion. Time, in the private suite, became a fluid and cruel dimension. It wasn't marked by sunrises or sunsets, but by the shifting of nursing shifts. The cheerful morning nurse with her loud, "Good morning, Mr. Adebayo." the quiet night nurse who checked vitals under the glow of a single lamp. It was measured in the changing flowers, lilies from a business partner, orchids from a cousin in Abuja, that bloomed, wilted, and were replaced in a silent, fragrant cycle of decay and renewal. Hope, that bright and stubborn flame Neoma had carried like a torch, began to wither. In the beginning, every slight movement, a twitch of a finger, a flutter beneath an eyelid, had sent her heart leaping into her throat, summoning doctors in a flurry of white coats. Each time, the response was gentle, tempered, involuntary. Mrs. Adebayo, the body's random synapses. It doesn't indicate awareness. The words were a cold drip, slowly wearing down the stone of her faith. The children, each grappling with the suspended animation of their father's life, began to change. Their orbits, once tightly bound to the hospital room, started to drift, pulled by the inexorable gravity of a world that continued to turn. Chaik became a ghost in the corridors of Adebayo Holdings. He moved into his father's office, not out of ambition, but out of a desperate, grim duty. The empire could not stall. Thousands depended on it. His visits to the hospital grew shorter, more functional. He would stride in, smelling of cologne and boardroom tension, his tablet always in hand. "How is he today?" he'd ask, his eyes scanning the monitors rather than his father's face. "The same," Neoma would whisper. Chaik would nod, a sharp, frustrated gesture. He'd place a hand on his father's arm, a brief, awkward contact, then turn to his mother. "The Singapore deal is closing. I need to review the final terms. I'll be back tomorrow." He carried the weight of two men now, and it bowed his shoulders, hardening his gaze. The hopeful son was being carved into a stoic CEO, and his love for his father began to express itself not in whispered encouragements, but in maintaining the legacy that lay comatose. Amara, armed with her medical knowledge, fought a silent, brutal war. She pored over his charts, attended the neurology consultations, and translated the cold, clinical language for her family. It was both a blessing and a curse. She could decipher the meaning behind the steady, unvarying lines on the EEG, could understand the implications of the minimal responsiveness noted in the reports. Her hope was chipped away not by a lack of love, but by an excess of understanding. She began to grieve in advance, a quiet, professional mourning that made her visits feel like rounds. She would check his 4 lines, adjust his pillows with expert hands, and murmur to her mother about skin integrity and passive range of motion exercises. The daughter was being swallowed by the physician. Tochi's erosion was the most visible. His initial, raw grief curdled into a directionless anger. The university became a distant memory. He would slump in the visitor's chair for hours, headphones on, his eyes glazed, scrolling through his phone, a portal to a life of parties, memes, and trivial concerns that felt like a grotesque parallel universe. Sometimes he'd talk, his words tumbling out in rushed, impassioned bursts. "Dad, you have to wake up. You have to see this new artist I found. You'd hate it. It's all noise, but we could argue about it. Please, just open your eyes." When silence was the only reply, the anger would flash. He'd storm out, disappearing for days, returning with red-rimmed eyes and the faint smell of liquor, a hollowed-out version of the vibrant boy from the Sunday dinner. Neoma watched them fracture, each broken piece reflecting her own inner splintering. Her vigil continued, but its nature changed. The stories she told became more like incantations, rituals performed to ward off the creeping dread rather than conversations meant to spark a connection. She still played Fela, but sometimes she would just sit in the silence, holding his limp hand, staring at a fixed point on the wall, her own mind a numb blank. The doctors' conferences became a dreaded ritual. Every 6 weeks, the same group of experts would gather, their faces growing increasingly familiar and increasingly grave. Persistent vegetative state, minimal conscious state, at best. Long-term neurological outcomes remain poor. The words were no longer shocking blows, but heavy, familiar stones added to the bag she carried. One afternoon, after such a meeting, Neoma returned to the room. Amara was there, studying a new brain scan on her laptop. "They don't see change, Amara," Neoma said, not a question. Amara closed the laptop slowly, unable to meet her mother's eyes. "The neural pathways. Mom, the damage is extensive. Every month that passes without significant change, The prognosis for any meaningful recovery diminishes. Her voice was quiet, clinical, and it landed with the finality of a tombstone settling into earth. Neoma looked at Alistair. She saw the slight hollowing of his cheeks despite the feeding tube. She saw the subtle atrophy of the muscles in his once powerful arms. She saw not her husband, but a testament to time's patient, destructive work. She walked to the bed and took his hand. She didn't launch into a story. She didn't massage it. She just held it, feeling the cool, pliant skin. The ember of hope didn't go out, not yet. But it grew very, very small, buried deep under the accumulating ashes of months of silence, medical jargon, and the slow, heartbreaking erosion of the family that waited in the void with him. The vigil was no longer a bridge to a future. It was becoming a monument to a past that felt increasingly out of reach. The fracture. The 2-year anniversary of the accident arrived not with a bang, but with a suffocating, heavy quiet. It seeped into the private suite like a fog, dulling the edges of the flowers, making the constant, low beep of the monitors seem louder, more accusatory. There was no cake, no gathering, no acknowledgement, really, except for the profound, unspoken weight of it. 730 days. Neoma sat in her now permanent chair, a book open but unread on her lap. She looked at Alistair, and for the first time, the act of seeing him felt like a strain. The mental gymnastics required to superimpose the vibrant man onto this still form were exhausting her. Her memories, once sharp and comforting, were beginning to feel like stories about a stranger. The sound of his laughter was growing faint in her mind, replaced by the relentless, synthetic rhythm of the ventilator. Her prayers had changed. The passionate, desperate pleas of the first year, "God, bring him back to me," had worn down to a brittle, rote recitation. Now, they were whispers of exhausted surrender. "Lord, give me strength to endure this." The hope was not gone, but it had metastasized into something quieter, more painful, a hope not for restoration, but for the endurance to bear the unending present. The children's orbits had widened into separate, lonely ellipses. Chike's visits were now calendared events, slotted between investor calls and international flights. He would enter the room like a CEO entering a subsidiary office, his energy a disruptive force of pure present tense. He'd kiss his mother's cheek, a quick, dry press of skin. Any change? None, NWAM. A tight nod. He would stand at the foot of the bed, hands clasped behind his back, and deliver a report. "We closed the Accra deal. Share prices are up 3%. The board is asking about succession planning." He spoke to the room, to the idea of his father, but his eyes rarely settled on the man in the bed for long. It was too dissonant. The father who had taught him to swim, to negotiate, to lead, was now a passive listener to quarterly earnings. Chike's love was now expressed solely through stewardship, a fierce protection of the empire that was his father's last active heartbeat in the world. Amara had returned to London, pulled by the threads of her own life. Her practice, her husband, her infant son. Her visits were monthly, week-long marathons of guilt and clinical analysis. She would spend hours talking with the medical team, her face a mask of professional concentration. When she sat with her mother, the conversation was peppered with terms like autonomic function and cognitive motor dissociation. She had begun to gently, persistently, prepare Neoma. "Mama, we need to think about long-term care facilities. The home environment, with the right nursing, might be better than a hospital suite indefinitely." She grieved in the future tense, mourning the father she feared would never again be whole. Tochi was simply absent. He had dropped out of university. He was somewhere in Lagos, or maybe Abuja, or possibly Dubai. The reports were vague and came through worried friends. When he did appear, it was a shock. He was thinner, his eyes shadowed, his easy smile replaced by a sardonic twist of the lips. He would sit for 10 minutes, jiggling his knee, unable to look at his father, before mumbling an excuse and fleeing. His grief had nowhere to go but outward, manifesting as a reckless rejection of the world that had taken his anchor. The fracture was not a dramatic fight. It was in the silence that stretched between them during the rare moments they were all in the room together. It was in the way Neoma could no longer find the energy to bridge their disparate pains. It was in the different languages they now spoke. Chike's language of business, Amara's language of medicine, Tochi's language of escape, and her own, a dying language of memory and fading hope. One evening, as a tropical dusk painted the sky in mournful shades of purple and orange, Neoma sat alone. She realized with a cold, clear certainty that she was no longer waiting for something. She was just waiting. The vigil had become her life's purpose, but it was a purpose devoid of expectation. She was tending a shrine, not guarding a bridge. She reached out and took Alistair's hand. It was a habitual gesture, but the connection felt different. It felt like holding the hand of a beloved monument, revered, familiar, but stone cold and unchanging. A single, hot tear traced a path down her cheek, not for him, but for herself. For the woman she had been 2 years ago on that sunlit driveway, waving goodbye, brimming with a future that had been violently erased. The family, once a symphony, was now a collection of isolated instruments, each playing a different, discordant song of grief. The unity that had been their strength was fracturing under the unbearable, sustained weight of a hope deferred. And in the center of it all, Alistair lay still, the silent, oblivious fault line upon which their world had broken. The unthinkable decision. The conference room adjacent to Alistair's suite was a place of false comfort. Plush chairs, a polished mahogany table, a watercolor of a serene lagoon on the wall. It was designed for discussing mergers or philanthropic strategies, not for deciding a life. The air conditioning hummed too loudly, a sterile white noise that did nothing to cool the fever of grief in the room. They were all there, assembled like a grim board meeting. Chaik, at the head of the table, looked every inch the CEO, but his knuckles were white where they gripped a pen. Amara sat straight-backed, a medical file closed before her like a verdict she already knew. Tochi slouched at the far end, his hood pulled up, a visible barrier against the world. Neoma sat between her children and the door, as if poised for flight, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her wedding band a cold, heavy weight. Dr. Ibe, the South African neurologist who had been with them from the beginning, stood before a lightbox, 2 recent brain scan films clipped to it. The images were ghostly, intricate maps of a silent continent. 2 years and 4 months. Dr. Ibe began, his voice respectful but devoid of softness. Softness would have been a cruelty here. We have exhausted every conventional therapy. We have seen no meaningful neurological improvement. The scans you see here, he pointed with a laser pen. This area, responsible for higher cognitive function, shows severe, permanent hypodensity. This pathway, crucial for voluntary motor command, is non-responsive. He clicked off the light box and turned to face them. The room felt darker. Clinically, Alistair remains in a persistent vegetative state. His body functions are maintained by support. He shows no signs of awareness, no response to deep stimulus, no evidence of a conscious self. The chance of any significant recovery at this stage is statistically negligible. The word negligible hung in the air, a clinical scythe. Chaik was the first to speak, his voice a tight wire. "What are you saying, doctor?" In plain English. Dr. Ibe sighed, the weight of 1,000 such conversations in the sound. "I am saying that the man you knew is not coming back. The body in that room is a shell being sustained by machinery. This is not living. It is an extended biological process." A sharp, punched-out sound came from Tochi's direction. He had pulled his hood lower. Amara spoke next, her doctor's voice trembling at the edges. "He's right. The medical literature is unequivocal after this duration with this level of injury. We're not treating an illness anymore. We're prolonging an absence." She couldn't look at her mother. Neoma felt the words like physical blows. She had heard versions of them before, but never so starkly, never with the finality of a group pronouncement in this terrible, formal room. She stared at the grain of the mahogany table, seeing instead Alistair's smile, feeling the ghost of his hand in hers. "So what are the options?" Chaik asked, the pragmatist forcing the agenda forward, even through the horror. "You can continue supportive care indefinitely," Dr. Ibe said. "He could remain in this state for years. Or, you can consider the withdrawal of life-sustaining treatment. It is a humanitarian option to allow a natural end to a process that has, for all human purposes, already concluded." No, the word was out of Neoma's mouth before she could think, raw and instinctive. Every cell in her body revolted. To agree was to become the instrument of his death. It was to surrender the last, frayed thread connecting her to him. "Mama," Chaik said, his voice softer now, pleading. "Look at what this is doing to you. To all of us. Dad is gone. This isn't him. He wouldn't want this. He wouldn't want to be a museum exhibit, a thing in a bed. He lived with too much purpose for that. You don't know what he would want. Neoma cried, her composure shattering. He is my husband. You cannot ask me to. He was my father. Chaik's own control broke, his voice cracking. And I am trying to honor him by letting him rest. By remembering him as he was, not as this shadow. Amara reached across the table, tears streaming silently down her face. Mama, I have seen this. As a doctor, this is not peace. It's a limbo, and we're all trapped in it with him. We have to let him go. We have to let ourselves go. Tochi suddenly shoved his chair back, the legs screeching on the floor. I can't listen to this, he yelled, his face contorted. You're all talking about killing him. In this nice room, with your nice words. It's murder. He fled, slamming the door behind him. The slam seemed to release the pressure in the room, leaving a vacuum of utter despair. Neoma looked from Chaik's anguished, set face to Amara's tear-streaked, resolute one. She saw their pain, their exhaustion, their own form of love, a love that wanted to end the suffering, even if the one suffering seemed unaware. She saw that she was alone. The keeper of the shrine was the only one who still believed it was a bridge. The fight drained out of her, leaving a cold, hollow exhaustion so deep it felt like death itself. What was she fighting for? A heartbeat on a monitor? A body that did not know her? Was her loyalty to the man, or to the terrible, beautiful habit of hope? Her shoulders slumped. The movement was a physical surrender. She looked at Dr. Ibe, her eyes begging for an absolution he could not give. How? How would it work? She whispered, the words tasting of ash. Dr. Ibe explained gently. They would not act immediately. They would give a period of time, a final month, for the family to say goodbye, for a miracle, if one was coming. At the end of that month, if there was no change, they would gently, painlessly, withdraw the support. One final month. Neoma nodded, the movement small and mechanical. She had agreed. The thread, held for so long, had finally slipped from her numb fingers. The unthinkable was now the plan. As she stood on trembling legs, the world tilted on its axis. She was no longer a wife waiting for her husband's return. She was a widow in waiting, marking time until a machine was switched off. The love that had fueled her vigil had been twisted into its opposite, a countdown to an end. The funeral plans. The granting of that final month did not bring peace. Instead, it unleashed a dreadful, practical momentum, a current that pulled them all forward into a future they now had to materially prepare for. Hope, even the faint, ghostly kind Neoma had harbored, was now officially on a clock. And with the cessation of hope came the grim machinery of farewell. Neoma found herself moving through the days in a state of eerie detachment. She still visited the suite, but the ritual had changed. She no longer told stories of the past. Instead, she sat in silence, holding his hand, as if trying to memorize the exact temperature and texture of his skin to imprint it upon her soul before it was lost forever. She was gathering relics, the feel of his hand, the sound of the ventilator's rhythm, the way the afternoon light fell across his blanket. One afternoon, 3 weeks into the final month, she returned from a walk in the hospital garden, a futile attempt to clear the fog in her mind. As she approached the suite, she heard Chaik's voice from the slightly ajar door. He was not inside the room, but in the small adjoining sitting area, talking on the phone. His tone was low, efficient, and utterly shattering. Yes, the marble. The Italian white with the gray veining, not the pure Carrara. He would have thought the Carrara was too showy. Yes, the family plot in a Koi cemetery. The dates are not confirmed, but provisionally, look at the end of next month. The order of service will be traditional, but with a modern tribute. My sister will handle the musical selections. Neoma froze, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a gasp. The words were not abstract medical terms. They were concrete, tactile details of her husband's non-existent funeral. Marble. Dates. Order of service. She could see it in her mind. The gaping hole in the earth, the cold, veined stone, the program with his smiling face on the cover. She backed away silently, her heart hammering against her ribs as if trying to escape the reality her ears had just absorbed. She did not confront him. What would she say? He was doing what needed to be done. He was being the leader, the pragmatist, the son who was shouldering the unbearable logistics of death so others could simply grieve. but the hearing of it made it real in a new and horrifying way. It was no longer a possibility discussed in a clinical conference room. It was a plan, floral choices, and granite samples. It was happening. She turned and walked blindly down the corridor, past the nurse's station, past the blinking lights and rolling carts, out into the harsh Lagos afternoon. The sun was obnoxiously bright, the traffic a roaring beast of normal life. She walked without direction, the image of that gray-veined marble swimming before her eyes. For 2 years, she had fought the narrative of ending. She had been the lone voice insisting on continuity, on the not yet. Now, she had assented to the timeline, and the world had instantly leapt ahead to the conclusion. Her family had crossed a psychological Rubicon. They were now living in a world where Alistair was already dead. The month was not a period of waiting for a miracle. It was a logistical buffer. That night, in the empty silence of their Ikoyi mansion, a silence that now felt rehearsed, a preview of the permanent silence to come, Neoma broke. She did not weep gently. She collapsed on the cool marble floor of their vast bedroom, a room that echoed with his absence, and sobbed with a raw, animal grief. She wailed for the husband she had lost, for the future that had been stolen, for the unbearable cruelty of having to plan for the physical disappearance of the man whose presence still dominated every corner of her heart. She cried until she was hollow, until the sobs subsided into shaky, ragged breaths. And in that hollowed-out state, a terrible numbness took root. The fight was truly gone. The love was still there, a vast, aching ocean of it, but it had nowhere to go. It was love for a ghost, for a memory, for a man who existed only in photographs and in the quiet, stone-faced determination of a son choosing his casket lining. The next day, and the day after, she did not go to the hospital. She stayed in the dim quiet of the house, moving from room to room like the ghost she felt herself becoming. She answered no calls. She spoke to no one. She was practicing, she realized with a stab of icy clarity. She was rehearsing for the role of widow, for the long, empty stretch of life that began after the last hymn was sung and the last mourner drove away. The vigil in her heart was over. All that remained was the calendar, its pages turning with a slow, inevitable finality toward a date that had, in every way that mattered, already arrived. Alistair Adebayo, to the world that moved on, was already a memory, and Neoma, in her silent mansion, was beginning the long, lonely work of learning how to remember. The hollow goodbye. With only 3 days left on the calendar, 3 tiny squares that felt like the final, crumbling ledges of a cliff, Neoma forced herself back to the hospital. It was not hope that drove her, but a grim, dutiful love, and the terrifying fear that if she did not say a conscious goodbye, she would regret it for the rest of her life. The suite felt different. It no longer felt like a room of waiting, but like a beautifully appointed tomb. The air was stale, the flowers on the side table were past their prime, their petals browning at the edges. The cheerful morning nurse had been reassigned. A quieter, more solemn nurse now handled the shift, her eyes full of a pity Neoma could not bear. She dismissed the nurse with a whisper. "I'd like to be alone with him." The words sounded like something from a film. When the door hissed shut, the silence was profound. Only the metronomic beep of the heart monitor and the mechanical sigh of the ventilator filled the space. They were no longer sounds of sustenance, but a countdown. She did not sit in her usual chair. Instead, she stood at the foot of the bed, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, and just looked. She conducted a final, heartbreaking inventory. She studied his face, trying to see past the waxy pallor and the slight sag of his jaw. She traced with her eyes the lines she used to kiss, the laugh lines at his eyes, now still, the strong line of his brow, now untroubled by thought. She looked at his hands, resting atop the starch-white sheet. They were still beautiful hands, but they were the hands of a statue. There was no anticipation in them, no readiness to grasp, to build, to hold. This was it. This was the last time she would see him like this, before the doctors came with their gentle voices and their final, merciful act. Before he became truly, irrevocably still. A wave of nausea washed over her, followed by a dizziness that had nothing to do with the room. It was the vertigo of letting go of a cliff edge after clinging for 2 long years. Slowly, she moved to the bedside. She did not take his hand immediately. Instead, she pulled her chair so close her knees touched the bed frame. She leaned forward, her face inches from his. "Ollie," she whispered, her voice a dry rustle in the quiet. "It's me." There was, of course, no response. Not even the phantom twitch she used to pray for. "I don't know if you can hear me. I've always talked as if you could. But today I have to speak as if you can't." A hot tear broke free and landed on the sheet beside his arm. "They are going to let you go? In 3 days." I agreed. She swallowed a sob, forcing the words out. They were the most difficult words she had ever spoken. "I have to say goodbye. I have loved you since I was a girl. You have been my entire world. You gave me our beautiful children, this amazing life. You gave me you." Her voice cracked. "And I cannot hold on to you anymore. It is breaking me. It has broken our children. We have to set you free." She reached out then and took his hand. It was cool, utterly passive in her grip. She brought it to her lips and kissed his knuckles, the gesture filled with a lifetime of tenderness and a present of utter despair. "I will love you until my last breath. I will see you in Chaik's resolve, in Amara's compassion, in Tochi's spirit. I will see you in Chitty's smile." She was weeping openly now, her tears falling onto their joined hands. "But I have to let this part of you go. Forgive me. Please, if you are anywhere, forgive me for giving up. But you are gone, my love. You have been gone for a long time." She sat there for an eternity, crying silently, holding his hand against her wet cheek, pouring every ounce of her love, her grief, her gratitude, and her apology into that final touch. She was not praying for a miracle anymore. She was performing a sacrament of release. Finally, emotionally spent, she gently laid his hand back on the sheet. She smoothed his hair, a gesture from 1,000 mornings past. She leaned over and placed one last, lingering kiss on his forehead. "Goodbye, Alistair," she breathed into his skin. "Go in peace, my husband. Go in peace." She sank back into the chair, hollowed out. The goodbye had been said. The vigil was formally, emotionally concluded. All that remained was the terrible, passive act of witnessing the end. She felt a terrifying emptiness, a void where her hope and her fight had once been. She was now just a woman in a chair, waiting for her husband to die, the love in her heart a vast, silent scream in an empty room. She had surrendered to the current, and now there was nothing to do but be carried toward the edge of the world. The unexpected visitor. The hollow silence that followed Neoma's goodbye was its own presence in the room. It was a heavy, woolen quiet, broken only by the machines that now seemed to mark time not for a life, but toward an end. She had no more tears. She felt scraped clean, a vessel emptied of everything but a dull, accepting ache. She stared at the wall, seeing nothing, her mind a numb blank. She was simply waiting for the clock to run out. The soft creak of the door was an intrusion. Neoma assumed it was the nurse returning, perhaps to check the for or adjust a setting with that new, funereal gentleness they'd all adopted. She did not turn, but the footsteps were wrong. They were not the squeak of rubber-soled shoes on polished linoleum. They were the faint, almost silent pads of bare feet. Slowly, Neoma turned her head. A little girl stood just inside the doorway, backlit by the fluorescent light of the corridor. She was a small, stark silhouette of rags and dust. Her dress, once perhaps a bright color, was now a faded, dirty gray, hanging loosely on her thin frame. Her feet were bare, the soles nearly black. A cloud of unkempt curls framed a face that was all eyes. Enormous, dark pools that seemed to absorb the light of the room rather than reflect it. In one hand, clutched with a curious solemnity, was a half-empty bottle of Fanta. The orange liquid inside looked warm, flat, a mundane object made strange by the context. The sight was so bizarre, so utterly disconnected from the sterile, sorrowful reality of the suite, that Neoma's exhausted mind could not immediately process it. She simply stared. The girl stepped fully into the room, letting the door sigh shut behind her. She didn't look around at the expensive machines or the flowers. Her ancient, knowing gaze went straight to the bed, to Alistair, then swung to Neoma. "Good afternoon, Mama," the girl said. Her voice was clear and calm, not the timid whisper of a lost child, but the assured tone of someone arriving exactly where they intended to be. Neoma blinked, the social niceties of a lifetime pushing through her stupor. "Hello," she heard herself say, her own voice rough from disuse and tears. "Are you lost? This is a private room." "No," the girl replied simply. She took another step forward, her bare feet making no sound. I came for him. She lifted her small, grimy hand and pointed a finger directly at Alistair's still form. A cold trickle, something sharper than exhaustion, moved down Neoma's spine. I came for him. The words echoed ominously in the quiet room. Was this some spectral figure, a messenger of death dressed in the guise of a homeless child? Had her goodbye summoned something? What do you mean? Neoma asked, a faint tremor in her voice. She pushed herself upright in the chair, a protective instinct flaring weakly. You shouldn't be in here. You need to leave. The girl's eyes held hers. There was no fear in them, no pleading, only that unsettling calm. He will wake up, she stated, as if announcing the sun would rise. She held up the bottle of Fanta. The sugary drink caught the light. With this, the absurdity of it, the towering million-naira medical technology surrounding them, the years of expert care, the profound neurological mystery, all being challenged by a warm bottle of cheap soda held by a ragged urchin, it was too much. It broke through Neoma's numbness and sparked a faint, bitter ember of anger. What do you know, child? She said, her voice gaining strength, edged with the bitterness of 2 years of crushed hope. You know nothing of this pain, nothing of these machines, this waiting, this nothingness. She gestured wildly at the bed, at the monitors. Leave us. Please, just go. The girl didn't flinch. She took another step closer, not to Neoma, but toward the bed. Her eyes, those deep, knowing pools, locked with Neoma's one more time. Trust me, she said. 2 words, softly spoken. They carried no logical argument, no medical proof, no promise of divine intervention. Yet, they landed in the sterile air of that room with the weight of a commandment. Trust me. And in that fractured moment, something in Neoma's soul, something buried beneath 2 years of despair and 3 days of hollow grief, stirred. It was not hope. Hope was too grand a word, too bright a flame for this flicker. It was the ghost of intuition, the last vestige of a belief in mysteries that science could not chart. It was the part of her that had once believed in a God of miracles, even when she had stopped asking for them. Her protest died on her lips. Her hand, which had risen to gesture toward the door, fell back into her lap. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She was suspended, caught between the crushing weight of accepted reality and this utterly insane, tiny possibility offered by a pair of calm, dusty feet and a bottle of Fanta. She did not say yes. She did not nod. But her silence, in that charged instant, was not a refusal. It was a paralysis of will, a crack in the dam of her resignation just wide enough for something impossible to slip through. She watched, utterly motionless, as the little girl turned her back on her and walked, with a purpose that was both gentle and absolute, straight toward the billion-naira bed and the man the world had already given up for dead. The pouring. The little girl moved with an unshakable certainty that defied the sterile, somber gravity of the room. To Neoma, watching from her chair as if paralyzed, the child seemed to glide across the polished floor, her bare feet making no sound, her ragged dress a whisper against the silence. She stopped beside the high-tech bed, a tiny figure dwarfed by the machinery of modern medicine, the ventilator's plastic tubing, the four-pole with its dripping bags, the bank of monitors with their scrolling green lines. She had to stand on the very tips of her toes to see over the railing. She placed the half-empty bottle of Fanta on the bedside table with a soft clink that was absurdly loud in the quiet. Then, with a tenderness that was both shocking and natural, she reached her small, grimy hand through the bed rail. Her fingers, delicate but sure, went to Alistair's face. She didn't fumble or hesitate. With a touch as light as a butterfly's wing, she gently used her thumb and forefinger to open his slack mouth. Neoma's breath hitched in her throat. A part of her screamed to lunge forward, to stop this madness, to protect her husband from this bizarre intrusion. But she was held fast, not by the girl's command, but by the sheer, sacred spectacle of it. The child's actions were not those of a mischievous urchin. They were ritualistic, purposeful, like a priestess performing an ancient rite. The girl picked up the Fanta bottle. She unscrewed the cap, the faint puff of escaping carbonation another surreal detail. She tilted the bottle. A thin, warm stream of bright orange liquid, the color impossibly vivid against the clinical white of the sheets, began to flow. It poured from the glass lip, arcing down into the dark, open cavity of Alistair's mouth. Neoma leaned forward, her knuckles white where they gripped the arms of her chair. Her heart was a frantic bird against her ribs. She stared, unblinking, at her husband's face, at his throat. Nothing happened. The Fanta pooled in his mouth, a small, shocking lake of mundane sweetness in a place meant for nutrient formulas and medication. Some of it trickled from the corner of his lips, a tiny orange tear tracing a path down his stubbled cheek. The girl poured a little more, patiently, as if watering a dormant plant. Stillness. Profound, agonizing stillness. The only movement was the steady rise and fall of his chest, dictated by the machine. The only sound was the relentless, mocking beep of the heart monitor, marking time that had just run out. The flicker that had stirred in Neoma's soul guttered and died, drowned in a sudden, cold wave of shame. What had she been thinking? What cruel trick of her exhausted mind had made her believe, even for a second, in this ragged fairy tale? This was not a miracle. It was a pathetic, messy farce. A homeless child playing a cruel game with a dying man, and she, Neoma Adebayo, had been a willing audience to her own humiliation. The bitterness returned, sharper now, laced with a deep, personal embarrassment. She had reached such a pit of despair that she had entertained this. She stood up abruptly, the chair scraping loudly against the floor, the sound harsh and final in the quiet. "That's enough," she said, her voice trembling not with hope, but with a fury directed at herself, at the girl, at God. "You need to." Her words choked off, because then she saw it. A movement, so faint it was almost a trick of the light. A tiny, almost imperceptible bob in the strong column of Alistair's throat. It was not the mechanical movement of the ventilator. It was something else, something internal. Neoma froze, her mouth still open, her rebuke frozen in the air. The girl, unperturbed, tilted the bottle once more. Another small stream of Fanta followed the first. And there it was again, stronger this time, unmistakable, a convulsive, reflexive swallow. The warm, sugary soda did not spill out. It was gone, drawn down into a body that had not initiated a voluntary action in over 2 years. The world narrowed to that point on his throat. The hum of the machines faded. The sterile room dissolved. There was only the movement, the sacred, impossible movement of a swallow. The swallow. Time, which had stretched into an endless, languid torment for 2 years, now snapped into a single, crystalline moment. It hung suspended between one heartbeat and the next, between the before of utter hopelessness and an after too terrifying to envision. Neoma stood utterly still, a statue of breathless anticipation. The rebuke that had been on her lips was forgotten, swallowed by a hope so sudden and violent it was like a physical blow. Her eyes, wide and unblinking, were locked on her husband's throat. The little girl acted with the serene patience of one who had never doubted the outcome. She gave a small, satisfied nod, as if a hidden clock had just chimed. She tilted the Fanta bottle one more time, administering a third, measured pour into Alistair's mouth. This time, the response was not a faint, ghostly twitch. It was a deliberate, unmistakable action. His Adam's apple bobbed, a strong, conscious-looking glide beneath his skin. His jaw tightened minutely, his throat working to guide the liquid down. A soft, wet, guttural sound echoed in the quiet room, a sound Neoma had not heard in over 700 days, the sound of her husband swallowing. It was a sound more beautiful than any symphony, more profound than any prayer. The effect was electric. The paralysis that had held Neoma shattered. A sound escaped her, a raw, fractured gasp that was part sob, part scream, part him. It was the sound of a soul being violently reinflated after being crushed flat. "Ollie." His name was a plea and a declaration on her lips. She stumbled forward, her legs feeling like water, her chair crashing to the floor behind her. She didn't notice. She fell against the bed railing, her hands flying to his face, his shoulders, touching him as if for the first time. "Alistair, can you hear me?" Ollie. His eyelids, those heavy, unresponsive curtains that had been drawn for so long, fluttered. Not the random, involuntary spasms the doctors had dismissed, but a slow, struggling movement, as if pushing against a great weight. A low, rasping groan vibrated in his chest, a rusty door hinge swinging open on a forgotten room. It was a weak, ragged sound, but it was his sound. It was a voice from the grave, scratching its way back into the world of the living. Neoma's world exploded into a kaleidoscope of pure, undiluted joy. The sterile hospital room was suddenly filled with a blinding, celestial light. The beeping of the monitor was no longer a dirge, but a triumphant fanfare. She was laughing and weeping at the same time, her tears now tears of resurrection, washing away the salt stains of grief. She grabbed his hand, and it was no longer a passive object. She felt a minute pressure, the faintest whisper of a squeeze. Or did she imagine it? It didn't matter. The swallow was real. The groan was real. "Doctor!" The scream tore from her throat, raw and powerful. She lunged for the nurse's call button, jamming her thumb onto it repeatedly, a frantic, staccato drumbeat of salvation. "Doctor, please. Someone. He's waking up. He's waking up." She was screaming into the hallway, her voice echoing off the polished floors. She was a woman possessed, a vessel of pure, chaotic euphoria. She turned back to him, cradling his face in her hands, her forehead touching his, whispering a torrent of love, of praise, of disbelief. "You're back. You came back to me. Oh, thank God. Thank God." In the maelstrom of her emotion, the weeping, the shouting, the desperate kisses she pressed to his hands and forehead, the world beyond the bed ceased to exist. The machinery, the room, the very hospital around her blurred into insignificance. There was only Alistair's face, the struggle in his eyelids, the miraculous movement in his throat. She did not see the little girl step back from the bed, a soft, knowing smile touching her lips. She did not see her pick up the now nearly empty Fanta bottle. She did not see her turn, those silent, bare feet carrying her across the room. She did not see the door swing open as the first panicked nurse rushed in, nor how the small, ragged figure slipped through the chaos and out into the corridor, unseen. The child had delivered her message. She had poured her improbable sacrament. Her work was done. As the storm of human joy and medical emergency erupted in the room behind her, she simply walked away, disappearing into the bright, indifferent light of the hospital hallway, leaving behind a miracle and a half-empty bottle of Fanta. The storm of joy, chaos, beautiful and blessed, erupted in Suite 401. The first nurse to burst through the door, drawn by Neoma's primal scream, skidded to a halt, her professional composure shattered. Her eyes, trained to observe the subtlest of signs, went immediately to the monitor. The rhythm was the same, but the man in the bed, his face was a mask of struggle, his eyelids fluttering like trapped moths against a window pane. And the sound, a weak, rasping, but undeniable groan. "Sweet Jesus," the nurse whispered, then her training kicked in. She hit the code blue button on the wall, but it wasn't for a failing heart. It was a summons for a miracle. "I need Dr. IB and the neurology team to Suite 401 stat. Patient is showing signs of emergence." Within seconds, the room was flooded with white coats. Dr. IB arrived, his usual weary calm replaced by wide-eyed, disbelieving urgency. He shouldered past Neoma, who was now clinging to the bed railing as if it were the only solid thing in a spinning universe, her body racked with shuddering sobs of joy. The medical team became a whirlwind of focused action. A penlight swept across Alistair's pupils. Pupils reactive and tracking, a resident called out, his voice cracking with excitement. Gentle hands pinched the skin of his arm. Alistair's hand twitched, a deliberate withdrawal from the stimulus. Motor response to pain. Localizing. Dr. IB leaned close. "Mr. Adebayo? Alistair, can you hear me? Squeeze my hand if you can hear me." The entire room held its breath. Neoma stopped breathing altogether. And then, a tremor. A faint, slow increase of pressure around the doctor's fingers. It was weak, but it was directed. It was an answer. A collective, gasped, "Oh," swept through the medical team. For these professionals who dealt in percentages and prognosis, this was not just a medical event. It was a crack in the fabric of the possible. "He's in there," Dr. IBE said, his voice thick with emotion. He looked at Neoma, his eyes shining. "He's coming back, Mrs. Adebayo." Those words were the final detonation. Neoma's knees buckled. A nurse caught her, guiding her gently into a chair, but she couldn't sit still. She was laughing and crying, her hands pressed to her mouth, her whole body trembling with the seismic force of her relief. The hollow ache of the last 3 days, the heavy grief of 2 years, was being violently evicted by a torrent of light. "Call my children," she cried to no one and everyone. "Call Chike. Call Amara in London. Find Tochi. Oh God, find Tochi." She fumbled for her phone, her hands shaking too violently to unlock it. A kindly nurse took it from her, promising to make the calls. The room buzzed with controlled, ecstatic frenzy. Vitals were checked, notes were frantically scribbled, plans were being made for a barrage of new tests, CT scans, MRIs, full cognitive assessments. But beneath the clinical hurry was a current of pure wonder. Nurses who had cared for this silent man for years wiped tears from their eyes. The respiratory therapist began carefully adjusting ventilator settings, preparing to see if the great, silent lungs could remember how to breathe on their own. Through it all, Neoma was the radiant, trembling epicenter. She kept reaching for Alistair's hand, whispering to him, "I'm here, my love. I'm right here. You did it. You came back." Every slight movement, a furrow of his brow, another weak cough, was a cause for fresh exaltation. In this storm of resurrected hope, of shouted orders and tears of joy, of the profound recalibration of an entire family's future, there was no room for anything else. The world had shrunk to this room, to this bed, to this impossible, glorious awakening. She did not see the little girl step back, a serene observer of the tempest she had unleashed. She did not notice the small, dusty feet retreat from the circle of frantic light around the bed. She did not register the soft click of the door closing. When Neoma's mind, hours later in her exhausted, blissful days, finally spiraled back from the singular focus on her husband to the memory of the child, the ragged angel, the bearer of the Fanta, she looked around, her heart filling with a new kind of urgency, a desperate need to offer thanks, to shower with blessings the instrument of her salvation. But the girl was gone. The half-empty Fanta bottle sat alone on the bedside table, a humble, sticky relic in the midst of the high-tech medical equipment. The child had vanished as silently as she had appeared, leaving behind only a miracle and a profound, echoing mystery. In the storm of joy, the calm at its eye had quietly slipped away. The search that failed. The following days in Suite 401 were a universe apart from the silent tomb of the week before. Now, the room hummed with a fervent, joyous energy. Alistair's progress, while medically fragile, was a relentless forward march. The ventilator was gone, replaced by the raspy, beautiful sound of his own uneven breaths. The feeding tube was removed. He could sip water, and his first conscious word, whispered like sandpaper over glass, was "Ineni, Oma." It had broken her and remade her. Yet, as the initial shockwave of the miracle subsided into the steady, grateful work of recovery, a new urgency took root in Neoma's heart, one that ran parallel to her vigil at Alistair's bedside. It was the need to find the girl. She described her to everyone, the nurses, the hospital administrators, the cleaning staff. A little girl, about 6 or 7, very thin, bare feet, a faded dress, maybe once pink or yellow. Her hair, a big cloud of curls. And her eyes, you would remember her eyes. The staff were sympathetic but puzzled. No one had seen such a child on the private floor. Security was tight. A homeless child couldn't just wander in. They humored the billionaire's wife, perhaps chalking it up to the stress of her ordeal, a hallucination born of desperate hope. But Neoma knew. The memory was etched in crystalline detail. The feel of the moment, the weight of the girl's gaze, the clink of the Fanta bottle. She had the physical proof. The bottle itself, now empty, which she had cleaned and kept on the windowsill like a sacred talisman. "We have to find her, Ollie," she told her husband one afternoon as he worked with a physiotherapist to lift his arm. His eyes, once clouded by the deep coma, were now clear and alert, though shadowed by the lingering fog of his long absence. They held a profound wonder at his own return. "The girl?" he rasped, each word an effort. "An angel," Neoma insisted, her voice fervent. "She saved you. She walked in and poured Fanta in your mouth, and you swallowed. She said, 'Trust me.'" Tears filled her eyes again, but they were tears of awe. "We must thank her. We must change her life." Driven by this conviction, she demanded to see the security footage. The hospital administration, eager to please the Adebayo family, complied. Neoma, with Chike by her side, sat in a dim security office as a guard pulled up the digital recordings from the corridor outside Suite 401 for that fateful afternoon. They watched the time-stamped footage in silence. They saw Neoma enter, her posture slumped in despair. They saw the quiet, empty hallway for the next 20 minutes. Then, at the exact moment burned into Neoma's soul, the door to the suite simply opened. The little girl walked out. Neoma gasped. There, go back. Show her coming in. The security guard rewound. They watched the door. They watched 5 minutes before, 10 minutes before. The door remained shut. No small figure approached. They checked the elevator lobby footage, the main entrance, the stairwell cameras for an hour on either side. The child appeared on no tape except for that one single shot, her back, exiting the room. There was no record of her arrival. It was as if she had materialized inside the suite itself. Chaik, the pragmatist, frowned. A glitch in the system. A camera must have been offline. But the security guard, an older man with a superstitious look in his eyes, shook his head slowly. All cameras were functional, sir. No gaps in the recording. She does not enter. A chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning traced Neoma's spine. The mystery deepened from a practical search into something spectral, divine. Undeterred, she launched a citywide campaign. She used Alistair's resources to fund a search. His picture, alongside a plea for information about a nameless little girl, was on billboards and in newspapers. Have you seen this, Angel? They offered a life-changing reward. She sent teams to scour the slums, the markets, under the bridges of Lagos. They showed the description to orphanages, to street shelter coordinators. Stories trickled in, sightings of barefoot girls, kind-hearted urchins, but none matched the specific, piercing clarity of Neoma's memory. None had those eyes that held the calm of centuries. None vanished without a digital trace. As weeks turned into months, the active search slowly wound down. The practical world had to accept that the girl was not to be found. But for Neoma, the failure of the search did not diminish the reality of the miracle, it consecrated it. She stood one evening by Alistair's hospital bed, now soon to be vacated for home. He was asleep, his breathing steady. She looked at the Fanta bottle on the sill, catching the last of the sunset. They had searched with all the might of human wealth and will, and found nothing. The child had come from nowhere and returned to nowhere. In the quiet of the room, the truth settled upon Neoma's heart, not as a disappointment, but as a divine revelation. She hadn't been a child of the streets. She had been a messenger, a vessel, sent at the precise moment when the last grain of sand was about to fall, when the final prayer had been a whisper of surrender. Neoma bowed her head, her hand finding Alistair's. The search had failed because it was looking for a human girl. But she had never been just that. She was a breath of grace, a footnote from God, written in the simple, sticky script of a half-empty bottle of Fanta. And you could not find an angel with flyers and CCTV cameras. You could only be forever grateful that, for one impossible afternoon, she had found you. The new dawn. The return to the Ikoyi mansion was not a homecoming. It was a reinvention of home. Udo had been a house of echoes and memories for so long. But now, as Alistair Adebayo crossed its threshold, leaning heavily on a walker, supported by Neoma's steadying arm, it was as if the very walls exhaled a breath they had been holding for 2 years. Light, real and unfiltered by hospital glass, streamed through the windows, seeming to seek him out, to welcome him. His recovery was a slow, meticulous pilgrimage back to himself. He had to relearn the simple geography of his own body, the command to lift a spoon, the balance to stand unaided, the neural pathways to form complex sentences. The brilliant mind that had built empires now focused with childlike intensity on a physical therapist's exercises, on stringing 3 words together. But through the frustration, there was a profound, quiet joy in his eyes. He was an explorer in a familiar land that had become wondrously new. The family, once fractured by grief, was welded back together in the forge of the miraculous. Chaik's boardroom rigidity softened. He would sit for hours, simply talking to his father about the business, not for decisions, but for the sound of his voice offering an opinion. Amara split her time between London and Lagos, her medical expertise now a tool of celebration rather than prognosis, monitoring his progress with tears of joy in her eyes. Tochi, the lost boy, was found. He became his father's shadow, his most patient and cheerful aide, the reckless anger in his eyes replaced by a awed tenderness. The Sunday dinners resumed, quieter, filled with a palpable, grateful warmth. Baby Chitty, now a toddler, would pat his grandfather's knee with sticky hands, a connection to the future Alistair had almost missed. But the miracle had changed Alistair on a fundamental level. The man who had measured his worth in acquisitions and influence now measured it in breaths taken unaided, in his wife's smile, in the weight of his grandson on his lap. He had been to the edge of nothingness and had been pulled back by a thread of inexplicable grace. It demanded a response. One evening, as they sat on the balcony where they had once said goodbye, Alistair, his speech now clear though deliberate, turned to Neoma. "The girl," he said. "We looked for her in the streets. But she found me in a place no street leads to." Neoma nodded, placing her hand over his. "She was a messenger. We were looking for a person. She was an answer. Then we must answer in kind," Alistair said, his gaze looking out over the teeming, hopeful, struggling city. "We cannot thank the messenger. So we must honor the message." From that resolve, the Dawn Foundation was born. Alistair poured a substantial part of his fortune into it, not as a philanthropic afterthought, but as the new central purpose of his wealth. Its mandate was clear: to find and shelter the unseen children of Nigeria, not with impersonal dormitories, but with safe houses called havens that provided not just food and beds, but education, healthcare, and, most importantly, a sense of irreplaceable worth. The foundation's logo, designed by Tochi, was a simple, elegant outline of a Fanta bottle with a rising sun replacing the orange liquid inside. It became Alistair's life work, his walking prayer. He would visit the havens, moving slowly but with undeniable presence, his story a whispered legend among the staff. He didn't just fund, he listened. He understood, in a way only one who had been utterly dependent on an unearned act of kindness could, the transformative power of a single, unexpected touch. Neoma kept her own ritual. On her dressing table, next to her perfumes and jewelry, sat the empty Fanta bottle. It had been washed, but a faint, sticky ring remained at the bottom, a tangible seal of the miracle. It was her daily relic. She would touch it every morning, a silent thank you to the God who moves in mysterious ways, whose angels sometimes appear in the guise of the poorest among us, bearing not gold or frankincense, but the mundane sweetness of a forgotten drink. The search for the little girl was formally closed, but it lived on in every child the Dawn Foundation sheltered. In every barefoot girl given shoes, in every hungry boy fed, in every curious mind given a book, they searched for her reflection. They knew they would never find her, but in looking, they found their own humanity. Alistair Adebayo's story became a national parable of loss, of impossible hope, and of redemption. But for the family in the Ikoyi mansion, it was simpler. It was the story of a second dawn. The first dawn had been one of ambition and worldly success. This new dawn, softer and more profound, was lit by grace and dedicated to gratitude. The man who had everything had lost it all, and had it returned by a pair of small, dusty hands. Now, his life was no longer about building an empire, but about building altars, in havens across the country, in the eyes of rescued children, and in the quiet, sunlit corner of a bedroom where a humble glass bottle stood, catching the light, a permanent testament to the day a miracle walked in on bare feet, whispered, "Trust me," and taught a family that sometimes the most powerful force in the universe is a stubborn, inexplicable, and utterly sweet drop of hope. Thank you, dear reader, for walking this emotional journey. Thank you for waiting with Neoma in the silent vigil, for feeling the weight of 2 long years, and for holding your breath as the final grains of sand fell. Thank you for believing, just for a moment, in the impossible sweetness of a miracle delivered in a half-empty bottle. This story was a testament to the tenacity of love, the fragility of hope, and the mysterious ways light finds us in our darkest hours. You are an essential witness to Alistair's second dawn. Wherever you are, may you carry with you a spark of its message, that hope is a stubborn, defiant, and beautiful force, and that sometimes, against all odds, it finds a way to swallow the darkness. Thank you for watching. Folded hands.